Thanks, everyone. So I feel like an old-timers meeting here with Doug and Candace and everyone in the room. Not that you're old, Candace, but so Candace and I were at the very first meeting when we organized CFBA and CIFRA. It feels like a very long time ago, doesn't it? I know. So my daughter always asks me. So I'm talking, actually, my title has changed, and which is actually a nice segue into the discussion we're about to have. That program at Berkeley has now been shifted into the business school, which makes a lot of sense. So I'm now in the Institute for Business and Social Impact, and I'm a research fellow there studying crowdfunding, alternative finance. So the point is, what is the broader impact of crowdfunding and how is it affecting other institutions? So I want to talk just a little update of the discussions around crowdfunding that don't oftentimes happen. So the first thing I want to talk about is there's a study, I believe it was Accenture, came out about 2 weeks ago, it was discussed at the Lend It conference on the potential size of the alternative finance market, specifically looking at banking. And since the title is the future of alternative finance, let's start there. They found in the next decade there will be 4.1 trillion with a T in revenue and 410 billion with a B in profits to be captured through alternative finance. Those are real numbers. So whether you believe that banks as we know them are dead or whether we believe it's a fundamental reorganization of some of the financial models, I think it's fair to say that there is a ground-shaking movement occurring in the way that consumers are going to choose their financial services and products, and bundled banking may not have much of a future. Crowdfunding is a very, very small slice of that very large pie, and we need to recognize that even in Europe, where crowdfunding has been going for several years, it's actually a relatively small market. But I'd like to talk about the broader discussion of what's occurring. So the next thing is, one of the things that's ironic about our industry, and Doug alluded to the lack of data, is US platforms are terrible about sharing their data with researchers. Europeans are pretty good at it. The Brits are very good at it, but the Americans are very, very opaque and not doing a very good job sharing information. And unfortunately, I get calls literally from the Fed, from Capital Markets Group and Treasury, from everyone in the administration, SBA, Commerce, Minority Business Development Centers, you name it. They all want to have reliable data about what's happening in our industry, and I don't have that data because people aren't sharing that data. I think everybody believes they have a big data play, and everybody believes they're going to monetize their data streams and make a ton of money, and hence they're not sharing. But the problem is the government's trying to regulate it inside of a vacuum. And I was talking to Ron Suber a little while ago, and I mentioned that I got a call from the Fed, and he says, Richard, in our world, getting a call from the Fed is not a good thing. You don't want them poking their nose. And the question they had, and which they asked me to address, is, do these markets open up new opportunities for predatory lending and predatory business practices, specifically regarding minority and women-owned businesses? And I've got a report coming out next month. I spent last summer collecting data, and the answer was probably not, but that report will be forthcoming. The next question is, what's the opportunity for alternative finance and crowdfunding for economic development? The reason that Europe and the UK are doing so well is their government has tax policies to incentivize investing in these models. Their markets have not developed organically. They've developed in reaction to tax policy and tax deductions. You can deduct, Sarah and I were debating what the number is. She says it's 50%, I think it's been raised, but you can deduct more than half of your losses if you invest through peer-to-peer lending platforms in the UK. And the government has officially endorsed this model. And imagine the Treasury Secretary of the US speaking to all the banks and saying, if you don't innovate, you're going to be forced to send your customers to your online competitors, which is exactly what the Chancellor of the Exchequer did in the UK about 6 months ago. And he said to the 4 major banks, if you don't innovate, we're going to force you to send your customers to the online lending platforms, and you'll have to document that you've done so. So the government isn't passive. And I think even though I'm not exactly a pro-regulatory person, I think there has to be a discussion of the role of the government to increase the size of these markets and opportunities. And the foundations are not showing up. The corporations are not showing up. The major donors aren't showing up. So this is an industry without, and Sam, where's Sam? Took off. So Sam just basically took on the mantle of trying to run CFPA, and I'm on the board as well. And we're trying to create a effective, vibrant professional association, but that has not existed for the last 3 years. CFPA has really not done anything. And it's time for us as an association, as an industry, to really have a voice that's coherent and has data on which it can make recommendations. So I'm going to make it, for those of you who have friends in corporate philanthropy and or high net worth individuals, somebody has got to start writing some grants to fund research so that we can answer the questions of the regulators so they don't regulate this industry into some problems. So that's my soapbox.
Where's your crowdfunding site for us to contribute to the research project?
Don't have one to try.
I'm sorry.
PayPal, I'll give you my address later. No, the irony is universities are so afraid of this, as you well know, Joseph, that it's very hard to get through administration. So our crowdfunding research program, if you want to follow the work we're doing and see what we're doing at Berkeley, is crowd.berkeley.edu. Pretty easy to figure out. Our crowdfunding site is crowdfunding.berkeley.edu. But ironically, our tax policy people inside the university said we couldn't give away rewards. So we're doing crowdfunding without perks as a university. So it's an interesting challenge of logic. So a couple of points. First of all, I think the states trying to do intrastate need to think about it as an economic development initiative and figure out training and education and working with the angel groups and doing outreach. It's not just going to happen organically. We've seen multiple states do intrastate and almost no activity anywhere, which I think is tragic. And I think the real reason is there's not enough education of the angel investors and recruiting angel investors. You have to get the angels on board for this to work. So a couple of updates, and then I will let other people talk. So some of you got my email. There's a new journal being launched called the Journal of Disruptive Finance. You can find it online, DF Journal. And I've been suckered into becoming the managing editor of that, meaning no salary. But it's a think Harvard Business Review meets the Journal of Finance meets Wired magazine. Translation, academics can't keep up with the pace of innovation. So we're not going to use a traditional 2- and 3-year publication cycle like academics do. So we're going to accept articles from all of you as well as articles from academics. So it's going to be a mixture of practitioners and academics. And we're going to cover basically everything happening in this field. So it's marketplace lending, crowdfunding, SoFi, Zopa, you name it. We want to talk about what's happening. So there's a call for papers out right now. So if any of you have a burning desire to submit an article, you can submit an article. And the deadline is actually only a couple of weeks away, but since I'm the editor, I may be able to fudge that a little bit for you. Talking about my own work, there's going to be a project at Berkeley this summer to basically plant a stake in the ground to define a taxonomy for this field. So what is crowdfunding, what is crowdfinance, what's alternative lending, define the business models, define the contractual relationships, because there's so much confusion. And being a good academic, I fully expect to be viciously attacked by my colleagues as soon as I publish it. And everyone's going to disagree with what I say, but that's great because the conversation will at least have started about how to define the terms in the field. We're also launching a joint project with Stanford. I know we're not supposed to say that publicly, but the two universities do actually get along pretty well. And we're going to be studying crowdfunding and charity. So does crowdfunding actually lead to more donations coming into? Are you crowding in more people or crowding out donors? And there's a lot of discussion around foundations right now around crowdfunding is going to allow them to directly channel their funds to the recipients of their aid. So basically disintermediation of the foundation, NGO, service provider, food chain. The NGOs are talking to me saying, how do we use crowdfunding to build sustainable revenue models to maintain our operations so we know the foundations don't want to fund us anymore? So there's a massive ground shift about to occur in foundation and philanthropic giving. I'm talking Bill Gates, talking the Rockefellers, the Markles, the Fords, Skulls, I mean lots of large foundations. Everybody believes that as this generation of millennials ages up, that because of their fundamental distrust of institutions, I'll use a real statistic, and Kim being a banker, you may appreciate this. There was an actual study done a little while ago asking millennials, would you rather have a root canal or open an account at a physical bank? 93% preferred the root canal.
That's because they never had one.
And maybe, good point, I have, and they're not very much fun. But that just as a measurement of attitudes and perceptions, there's a fundamental distrust of institutions. So large institutions are in trouble, whether those be banks or foundations or the Bill Gates Foundation. So we're also going to be doing a series of events. Those of you from the West Coast or get out to the West Coast, next to academic year at Berkeley, once a month we're going to have a crowdfunding forum. Basically, and that could be alternative finance, microlending, and not necessarily crowdfunding, but something within our model. So once a month we're going to take a piece of it, whether it's the economics of crowdfunding, minority lending, peer-to-peer marketplace and information asymmetries, whatever we're going to tackle, we're going to bring in some world-class experts and hopefully have some contention and have some debate and have some fun, and since it's Berkeley, we'll have some wine out on the Glade as well in between the events. So keep your eyes out for that. So with that, I'd like to just encourage you all to, yes, push for Title III, but also think about how other organizations can be using these provisions. Think of this as a set of tools. This is a way of engaging. I call crowdfunding accelerated resource mobilization. How are you collecting information? 70% of people that use crowdfunding and fail in their campaigns will do it again because they get a lot of benefit from crowdfunding that's non-financial. So think about whether it's the not-for-profits you work with or university alumni foundations, whatever. Think about how crowdfunding can be used more broadly. Well, today's discussion has been so focused on Jobs Act and Title III, I think we sometimes forget there's this whole range of activity by corporations. And I mean, GE, Lenovo, Kimberly-Clark, Dodge, Kia, Honda, DC Comics, I could go on and on, have done crowdfunding. There's a whole corporate layer that no one's talking about right now. The challenge of that is the very top 1% of the funding that we're seeing, the $5 million, $10 million campaigns, those are oftentimes now driven by major agencies. Those are not grassroots campaigns by an entrepreneur. You're seeing large, well-funded Madison Avenue and San Francisco agencies come in with very large spends on media and marketing. So it's distorting the market, and it's making it harder and harder for the smaller entrepreneurs to get noticed at that top tier. So the professionalization is starting to occur. Fortune 500 is now inside of crowdfunding. Sony's done crowdfunding. IBM's done crowdfunding. So what is that going to mean for innovation? So with that, I will open it up to any questions and let someone else go next.
Richard, if you were going to identify 2 or 3 people that you thought were kind of on the cutting edge, I mean, as you talk about crowdfunding in the wrap-up there, it's kind of different than just securities or just raising capital. So
Yeah.
who do you see that will be, I don't know, sort of the thought leader 2 years from now or 5 years from now?
That's a really hard question to answer. There's a guy named Ronald Cleverland in the Netherlands. He's probably been in 20 or 30 countries this year lecturing on crowdfunding. He's an incredibly bright guy. He's the vice chairman of the European Crowdfunding Network. So Ronald is very, very smart. It's hard to say. There's probably a lot of very smart people in Asia and China that I don't know. I'll be going over there for the first time pretty soon. Maybe Zha Chen might know some folks that he could recommend. Here in the US, it's really hard for me to say without picking favorites amongst a small family here. I think you're seeing a new crop of people starting to show up. If you look at these conferences and events, there's a new generation coming. And it's interesting that we're getting more professional, large institutional people, more corporates coming in, and also some fairly seasoned money managers starting to poke around. I think it's, I was in a meeting 3 years, a couple of months ago with Jamie Dimon. When I was with a venture firm, and he talked to my boss, Alan Hall, at the time, and he basically said, well, of course we're tracking this idiotic bill. And of course we're tracking peer lending. You think we're dumb? I mean, I'm paraphrasing Jamie's speak here. He said, once there's enough revenue for this to get interesting, then we'll just buy everybody out. We're going to not let there be a healthy revenue stream available that we don't control. So I think we're starting to get close to that day, that the large institutional players are starting to think about mergers and acquisitions and JVs, and I think 2016 will be the beginning of the roll-ups. We'll start seeing some acquisitions occur.
What makes you think that, Richard?
Just conversations I'm having with some pretty large private equity guys. Some people are profitable enough, they're interesting. I mean, Rocket Hub just got acquired. I don't think it was a great deal for them, but they just got acquired. A couple of their platforms are in play, so.
What makes the real estate crowdfunding so hot?
Perpetual and insatiable desire for more financing. I mean, the joke is there's never a developer who's not seeking funds. Almost like a good CEO of a startup is always raising the next round. And then also it's the syndication model. I mean, Steve did the report, so he's a better expert in real estate than I am. But my sense is there's been a massive demand for financing from the smaller tier developers, and they just cannot get their projects financed effectively. And crowdfunding is allowing them to do the syndication that happened in the 70s and the 80s much more efficiently and much faster. So I think real estate, example of my naivete, I was on a call about 6 months ago with a gentleman, and I introduction through a friend of a friend of a friend. I said, hey, I'll take the call. He's a Chinese gentleman. Turned out he was the 3rd wealthiest man in China. and he had a team of like 20 analysts on the call with me, and he was looking at figuring out which sectors of the American real estate market he should be investing his money in. And there's a lot of interest from China right now, specifically into the U.S. crowdfunding space, but most of that's real estate. Almost all of that's real estate, in fact. And many of the platforms have been financed by Chinese investors. So they're seeing something. They're incredibly smart. So I'm very interested to see what happens when Chinese money shows up in the 9 and 10 figure range.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.